1 week in, little shuffling in Joel Klatt's rankings. Georgia leapfrogging Ohio State. The Bucks moved from 1 to 2. Oregon was 4. Now they're not in his top 9. Penn State and Michigan both making minor moves. Wolverines dropping a few spots. Penn State made a slight move up after winning in Morgantown. And Fox Sports lead game analyst Joel Klatt joins us now for our weekly visit. Joel, I got to say, from where I sit, I thought USC was the most impressive Big Ten team in week one. The defense was vastly improved. Quarterback play was tremendous. Wide receivers were absolutely outstanding. They tackled extremely well. What were your biggest takeaways from the Trojans' win over LSU?
Well, a couple of things. All of those things that you just said, just for them. Yes, their defense was a vast improvement over what we saw a year ago and in previous seasons, really since Lincoln Riley became a head coach dating back to Oklahoma. D'Anton Lynn, their defensive coordinator, looks like he's fixed this thing right away. And this was not an offense that was supposed to struggle at LSU. I understand that they're replacing a lot of players, and yeah, they're probably going to get better. But remember, they got a couple of tackles that a lot of us who work in the draft arena, Rev, we think that those tackles could be first-round players. So this was not a light or bad offensive line that front seven was playing so physical against, in particular late in that game. I thought that Miller Moss was terrific, there's no doubt, but you can expect that from a Lincoln Riley quarterback. It doesn't matter who's been his quarterback. They've been terrific dating back to his time even as a coordinator. I think that the bigger point about USC is that they beat a team from the SEC that was similar to them in the preseason, thought to be about 4 or 5 in that range. And then what USC is, they kind of announced to the Big Ten, like, hey, you're going to have to deal with us at the top level. And I think that's a huge development. When you look at some of these schedules, you look at now all of a sudden that Penn State game with Penn State going to USC becomes an absolute monster. You look at that schedule that I think is actually favorable for USC and who they avoid. And then when they get Michigan, getting to play them in September as Michigan's continuing to try to get their feet wet, developing in a new quarterback and a new head coach and 2 new coordinators. So all of a sudden, USC's schedule is favorable, their defense is solid, and their quarterback looks real. And you can legitimately say, yeah, this team is going to be there and probably has an inside track on a playoff berth, if not a spot in the Big Ten championship game. And you can infer that all based on that one win over LSU.
You mentioned Penn State. I think their schedule gets really favorable now, too. They don't play a road game until October 12th when they go to USC.
That's
that
right.
Game you were talking about. You had them. You were front and center for that game, the long weather delay, obviously, in Morgantown. But really clicked the big plays under Andy Kotelnicki. It looked like a very different offense from what we saw a season ago. I know week one is about these broad, sweeping conclusions from very minimal actual evidence, but is it your feeling, based on what you saw, that perhaps this offense has turned the corner here?
Okay, so yes and no.
Okay, explain.
Okay, and yeah, exactly. It needs further explanation. I think that you'll agree with what I'm about to say, but this offense did things that we did not see them do a year ago. Okay, namely, like, for instance, Nick Singleton, as a true freshman in 22, had 7 runs of 40 or more yards. That led college football, led the FBS. And he did not have one last year, a big goose egg, Rev, and he's a big play guy. He's a home run hitter. And what did we see against West Virginia? A 40-yard touchdown run. That is a huge development for them to try to get that explosiveness back. Another number. Drew Aller was 124th in the country in terms of air yards per attempt in a quarterback sense. Okay, and it was right around 7.5. Well, you look at what Kansas was under Andy Kotelnicki, and regardless of quarterback, they were about 11 yards, air yards per attempt. So a vast difference, and they would sit in the top 10 in college football. What do we see from Drew Aller? Pushing the ball down the field. And I thought the evidence of their aggressiveness was right before the half. That was a time that let's face it, let's be honest. I was kind of expecting Penn State to just almost kneel on it, run out the clock, and take their lead into halftime. And they didn't do that. And they took a shot down the field. And I think that was the aggressive nature of Andy Kotelnicki. So that's the yes part. So now let's get to the no part. Why then is it no, Joel? Well, it wasn't any different. Because they did a similar thing to West Virginia last year in their first game, and then it started to fall apart. Now, I don't expect that to be the case, but you at least have to put that forth and say, we saw Drew Aller throw the ball down the field against West Virginia, and then they stopped doing that. And this fact that the only teams that they actually struggle with are Michigan and Ohio State. If you look at their regular season over the last 2 years, you'll see a team that is 20-0 against all teams not named Michigan and Ohio State. So, Rev, as good as it was, Penn State still remain to be seen because they've got to do it against that upper echelon talent like USC or Ohio State left on their schedule.
Yeah, they get that huge Ohio State game. That game, of course, in State College, first weekend in November. That one should be phenomenal. Oregon, we've had the Oregon-Ohio State game circled early on in the year as well. That one coming in October. Oregon did not look ready for that game in week one, Joel. They were not impressive.
They didn't look ready for Idaho.
No,
I mean,
really
like
didn't.
much less of that game. My goodness.
What did you make of that? We had this game on the Big Ten Network. I think we were all watching and just kept thinking at some point Oregon was just going to hit them with a couple big plays and just blow this game open, and they never did. What did you make of Oregon's struggles?
Well, first of all, can I give a shout out? I know both of these guys, but I thought Guy Haberman and Yogi Roth did an exceptional job on that game.
Phenomenal.
Because, they didn't allow the Idaho nature of that to shadow their broadcast. And I thought they did a great broadcast of a really good college football game. So I would just say that. And I don't normally throw out, analysis or thoughts on broadcasts, but I thought those two did a great job for obvious reasons, right? It's like stones in glass houses. Now, let me tell you why I was alarmed with Oregon. And Rev, it has to do with their offensive line. I think all of us say, the offensive line didn't play very well. And I'm sure that, you've brought up the numbers. 5 of their 8 penalties offensively. They ran the ball for under 3 yards per carry against Idaho from the FCS. They give up 3 sacks, which maybe in your mind you're like, well, that's not a ton. 3 sacks, like you can overcome that. They give up 5 all last season. All last season, Rev. So 3 to Idaho from the FCS should be like panic, throughout the building. If I'm Dan Lanning, I am fire and brimstone this week in terms of my expectation about the effort and the discipline and the detail that my team plays with, because they're about to face a team in Boise State that they've never beat. They're 0-3 against Boise State all time. You think those guys aren't going to be ready to play? Ashton Genty, after running for somewhere just south of 1 million yards in the first game and 6 touchdowns, they're going to be ready to go.
Yeah.
And we'll see if Oregon really is who we thought they were going to be, which is a team that was going to play at the top end of college football, be physical up front with Dan Lanning as the shining star, as a young coach, all those things. And it's like, I mean, you hate to say it this way, but it's like, Oregon had the whole preseason show on YouTube and all this stuff. And it's like, okay, I'm always reminded about that line from Gladiator. It's like the time for honoring yourself is over. And you got to put up and shut up. And that's what this season is going to turn into for Oregon.
I'm with you. It's a really interesting game coming up against Boise State. I'm fascinated to see how Oregon responds. They clearly were, all you have to do is listen to Dan Lanning in the postgame. They were not pleased with the way that it went down. He said that nor should they be, in no uncertain terms. I want to fast forward to this week a little bit. Nebraska was great in the opener. Dylan Raiola was everything we hoped he would be. That was UTEP. Now they got Colorado coming up this week. You know this rivalry very well. Ooh. You played in this rivalry. Colorado handed it to him last year, really pulled away late in that game. So you've got the animosity between these two programs. You have all the hype that Colorado got last year under Deion Sanders with what turned out to be not a very good team in terms of a 1-loss record. You get the superstars coming in on Colorado's side. You got all the hype surrounding Raiola. What's it going to take for Nebraska to win this game?
So Knowing that this was a bit like a big studio day, I'd record a podcast today and go on Colin's show. Obviously, I come on this show, which I love being on with you, Rev. And I thought to myself, I know I'm going to be asked about this game, so what's the best way that I can try to appear objective? And I was like, wear the most red shirt that I own, and this is it. It's like a kind of a salmon, like this soft red.
Not a pure red. No.
Well, of course not. I do not own a pure red shirt because of Nebraska. You have to understand, I grew up 20 minutes south of Boulder, Colorado.
Right.
Like, this is the game of my childhood, was Nebraska, Colorado. In fact, I owe this rivalry a lot, not only because I played in it and I love it, but the game in 2001, the 62-36 win that Colorado beat number 1 Nebraska and Eric Crouch, I was at that game as a fan, and that game was a turning point in my life because I was complaining about playing minor league baseball and how much I hated it, and I was kind of floundering, and my best friend in the world, his name's Scott Stalker, looked at me and was like, well, then just come here. And I was like, you know what? That sounds like a really good idea. So that was kind of the first time that I had thought that maybe baseball wasn't going to be it and I should go to school. Now we get into this game. This game, they're saying all the right things, at least the quarterbacks and the coaches, but there is no love lost here, going back years and years and years, because Colorado, in large part, built their program under Bill McCartney by pointing at Tom Osborne and the Nebraska Cornhuskers and saying that's going to be the standard that we're going to take down. Now, Matt Rule is trying to rebuild this program and doing an exceptional job of it. If you just look at the two rosters and the teams and the way they play and the details with which they play, Nebraska is the better team. The problem is that Colorado has the better top-end players. Shedeur Sanders is excellent. I mean, I think we all admit that and know that. Travis Hunter probably is the best non-quarterback in college football. And so they are the great equalizer. I know the line is 7.5, and Nebraska is at home, and that place is going to be electric, but you still have to deal with Travis Hunter. Number 12 might put a cape on his back and get 2 picks and go for 150 catching the football, and then all of a sudden you're in trouble if you're Nebraska. If I'm handicapping this, Nebraska is the better team. They have a quarterback that I think is going to be a great player, but they don't even need him to be great. Remember, and Rev, I'm sure you know this, like they lost those field goal games last year. I think there was 4 of them when they had 17 turnovers. 14 were by the quarterback. They don't need Raiola to be great. He doesn't have to be their savior. He needs to be a net positive for Nebraska, not a net negative. And they will turn into an 8, 9, 10 win team this year. Remains to be seen if they win this one. If they can beat Colorado, they're going to go into Ohio State as an undefeated.
It's very diplomatic. I'm really impressed with the way that you handled that. I'm going to ask you here at the end about the matchup that you're going to be calling the big noon game. It's the only top 10 game in the country coming up this weekend.
I'm so long-winded on everything else, and it's like we haven't even talked Michigan, Texas.
Let's talk a little bit about Michigan, Texas. Whether or not it's fair or unfair, look, Michigan's the defending national champ. There's going to be heightened expectations on them. They lost a ton. They lost their head coach. They lost 8 offensive players alone to the NFL draft, including a first-round quarterback. And now all of a sudden, everyone's going to say, okay, well, how do they measure up with Texas? Pretty early in the year to have to deal with a team as good as the Horns are. But Give us a sense. I mean, I know you study a ton of tape. Like, how do they match up? Is there an area where Michigan has an advantage? We know how good their defense is. What would it take here for Michigan to pull what I think would be a pretty significant upset?
Yeah, so first off, Texas this year reminds me a lot of Michigan last year, Rev. Lost in the semis the previous year, and they bring a bunch of experience, including a lot of experienced offensive linemen back. They're tough at the line of scrimmage. They've got speed on the outside. They've got talent, and they've got a culture. I think that's what people maybe don't pay attention to with Steve Sarkisian and the Texas Longhorns, is that they've got a really great culture in their building, and that has taken hold. And now you've got guys that have passed it down, and this is no longer Sarkisian trying to build a culture as much as it is entrenched in what they do, and they're going to bring an experienced, talented, and fast team with a good quarterback up to Ann Arbor. That reminds me a lot of Michigan last year. It just does. Michigan's advantage in this game is the fact that Texas defensively is still trying to break in some of these defensive linemen. They lose T'Vondre Sweat, these guys up front that were really good up front and really the bell cows of that defense. And Michigan, at least historically, would think that they can run the football and lean on a new defensive line. Now, I was not overly impressed in the first half with the way that the offensive line of Michigan played. They played way too high. That's not the leverage that I'm used to seeing out of Michigan, just watching the film. But that's where they've got to play well. Because in my estimation, Michigan has to protect their own defense. As good as their defense is, as good as the defensive tackles are, Kenneth Grant, Mason Graham, as good as Will Johnson is on the outside, they need to protect that defense, because if Sarkisian gets 65, 70, 75 bites at the apple, they're going to score a lot of points. They just will. There's too much speed and experience on that side. So Michigan has to limit the number of snaps, and they do that by being able to run the football. If they can run the football and limit Texas to 55 or fewer snaps, they're going to have a chance to win in the end, because as you know, and as I always talk about, Michigan is the great boa constrictor. They want to just take you and just squeeze you, and then eventually they suffocate you in the late third quarter and early fourth quarter. And it just remains to be seen if they can do that against a team that is this talented and experienced and tough at the line of scrimmage.
Well, it should be a great game. We look forward to the call coming up. Big noon on Saturday. Joel, always appreciate it. I look forward to this segment every week. Thanks a lot for your time.
Same. You bet, Rev. Have a good one, bud.